Thank you. And I'll say too, at the end, please come up and look at some of these items. Some of them are very carefully constructed reproductions. However, the canteen, the muskets, the drum, these are artifacts from the time period. If they could speak, I'd be sitting in the audience with you and listening to them tell. So the things we're talking about tonight, these things, they were witnesses. They were actually there. As you heard in the introduction, just by sheer chance, I was born in Sturbridge, Massachusetts. And if you've ever heard of Old Sturbridge Village, if you haven't, it's similar to a colonial Williamsburg, where people dress in period dress and talk about a certain time period. At Sturbridge Village, the time period focus is the 1830s. And because they tried to recreate the whole rhythm of rural American life, that included twice a year recreating what they call muster days or militia training days, when the townspeople gathered to practice their military maneuvers twice a year. That was my introduction to this strange topic of militias, and especially militias during peacetime. And of course, I'm 10 years old when this all happens, so, and drumming away. And so drums and funny hats and guns going off was definitely what hooked me. But I have slightly matured in the ensuing decades, so I have a little bit higher level interest in this topic than just the drums and the guns, but that's still a big allure today. So why study this militia system? It is not highly written about today. There's not a lot of books. It's very hard topic to do research about, for sure. However, it was a major part of American civic life, really from, let's say, 1607 Jamestown, all the way up, I'm going to say, fairly prominently into the 1870s, but continues into the early 20th century when this whole militia system becomes this thing that we now call the National Guard. So it is something that everyone is involved in. If you're a white dude, and everyone here is, and you're between the ages of your middle teens and you're advancing middle-aged, this is what you did. Twice a year at least, you were out there. It was a law. You had to do it. Today, I think civic duty, we don't have mandatory things like the militia system. You know, you think about being a good citizen and voting and maybe volunteering and maybe running for office and whatnot, but this was mandatory. Everyone had to do it. It's also a great way to kind of just study American history in general. When you start diving into different topics, the militia system does appear. So you can kind of choose your topic and encounter the militia system. Maybe you're into really nasty, divisive politics. Maybe you're into social reform movements like abolition. Maybe you're interested in technology and industrial revolution. All these, maybe you're interested in international affairs. All of these topics, the militia appears because it's such a huge part of early American life. And lastly, and this is my favorite thing, when history connects past to the present, this is why I love it so much. And now it's definitely no exception. When we are talking about the militia and the Second Amendment, I would argue there is no hotter topic right now than those things. It's certainly up there with abortion and immigration and foreign policy, Israel, Gaza. This is a hot button topic today. So I will consider this evening a very successful one if I can entertain you a little bit and maybe show you some stuff you haven't seen before, but also maybe get you to ponder our own time a little bit and connect past and present. Starting at the beginning, I'm beginning-wise, I'm just looking at early American settlement. We could go way back. We could go back into the 12th century and find regulations for your longbow must be in order and you must have so many arrows in your quiver to be ready for national defense. So there's a long tradition, but it starts as soon as settlement starts in America. So of course, we're all immigrants here. The immigrants that come to America are bringing their traditions, and certainly the militia tradition is a very well-established one by 1607 in Jamestown. This image by probably America's most foremost military artist right now, Don Traiani. This portrays Massachusetts in the 1630s, and that was commissioned by the National Guard. So we see these people doing their drilling. We see the drummer in the background looking a little bored, and they are training as they did a little more regularly in the early days. In the early days, we're looking at a wide age gap. In general, ages 16 to 60 for mandatory militia service. That's a pretty wide. Now, hopefully, it's usually understood that if bad things happen, you'd rather have the 19 and 20-year-olds and not the 16-year-olds. But they all had to be ready to go if necessary. And these guys, they were not like the militia I'm going to be focusing on in the 19th century. These guys got together a lot. They had guns in their hands a lot. They might have guns in their hands when they go out to work on the crops. So in our early days of colonial settlement, there were dangers around. It might be an Indian attack. It might be another European nation attack. So they're fairly busy. So what all are they doing militia before the revolution? I'm going to bring up just a couple of little examples here. An event maybe you've heard of, Bacon's Rebellion, gets a lot of attention in the history books. And a pretty cool topic unto itself, because it deals with everything from class warfare to desire to clear Indians far, far away. Lots of interesting topics. The reason I put up on the slide here, though, is because it is, we can classify it today as a domestic insurrection. And for most of American history, all of American history, the militia system, 1/3 of the militia's job was to put down domestic insurrections. Today, when we hear the word militia, we tend to think of some sort of paramilitary kind of group who are hostile in some way, distrustful of government, maybe very, very anti-government, and that's our modern image of a militia. Not the case back then. The militia is to defend the government. So any kind of a domestic revolt, their job is to put it down. I'll mention one bizarre event. This is in King George's War in the 1740s. And this is a great national park in Canada today, the Fortress of Louisbourg. It is captured by American militia, which isn't supposed to happen. The militia is supported by the Royal Navy who transport them, but the actual seizing of this fortress is done pretty much entirely by militia, which is very strange. But I mention it because this will come up over and over again in the later 18th and into the 19th century for people who defend the militia system. They'll say, don't you remember Louisbourg? That was a great one. And I threw this out here because it's, I sort of call it local history, right? Braddock comes through here on his ill-fated expedition where he is killed and he suffers a pretty terrible defeat. There are militia in that, couple hundred or more militia, and they do okay, but they're still defeated in this big battle. So militia are around before the revolution. Fast forward, 1775. April 19th, right next year will be our 250th anniversary, pretty cool, coming up here soon. Well, again, the militia here are going to be not like they are in the 19th century. These guys were very, very good. So our militia that are fighting at Lexington and Concord in the Battle Road back to Boston, these guys they're no slouches, okay? They drilled very, very regularly. They took part in target practice regularly. And in those days, 18th and early 19th century, psychological warfare is very, very important. And that's part of the reason we have these bizarre, fancy, colorful uniforms and these tall military caps, like the bearskin caps that the British wear. That's for intimidation. It's very, very important in this time period. These guys knew it. And they don't look like much because they're all dressed like farmers, but they deliberately chose the British manual from 1764. They learned it perfectly. You also had guys in here who were combat veterans from the War of from the French and Indian War, and they were exceptionally well drilled, unlike militia in most of history. So they knew darn well what they were doing. When they marched and they attacked the British on Concord Bridge, the British, they're not running away from a bunch of country bumpkins. They're running away from a essentially a professional military force that just so happens to be dressed in their regular street clothes. So it's something to keep in mind. These guys knew what they were doing. And the British noted, they said, oh my God, these guys drill better than we do, which is not usually said about militia. Following April 19th, we had the Siege of Boston. We have another famous battle, Bunker Hill. I put this one on the slide because into the rest of the century and well into the 19th century, people who defend militias are going to say, don't you remember Bunker Hill? And they will write in the 19th century, remember, if you can get militia behind a stone wall or some breastworks or fortifications, they will perform for you. And that's exactly what happens here. So this is a very famous thing for our American heritage. And if you know anything about this battle, the Americans did quite well until they, their ammunition is exhausted and they're driven out. But before they are driven off of these hills, they inflict serious damage on the British redcoats. We see in this picture, John Trumbull is a very famous author. I'm sure you've seen this picture before. There's Dr. Joseph Warren dying. I believe that is our first major patriot, would have been a huge founding father who dies. Above him, Thomas Knowlton in his shirt sleeves brandishing his musket so bravely. He's on borrowed time. He will die the next summer in the fighting in the disastrous New York campaign. So I've been kind of leading you astray here a little bit, right? I mean, this has been Mr. Positive, the militia, look like they're so well drilled and they know what they're doing. So are they great? No, they're terrible. They're horrible. And it's dangerous to overgeneralize, especially about an 8-year war. But in general, the American Army does not do that well in the Revolutionary War, and the militia they have a horrific record when it comes to fighting during the war. This is the only picture I could find. I don't love it because these guys, if they're running away, they shouldn't have guns in their hands. Because you can run a whole lot faster and you drop another 10 or 12 pounds when you lose a musket. But that's the way the militia looked most of the time in the war.
You say the Army, making a distinction from the Continental Army?
Yeah. In this early stuff, the Continental Army it's so new, it's still kind of militia. It's going to take a while to become what they become after Valley Forge and all that kind of stuff. So let's look at what people are talking about, the militia during this time period. And my first quote is from Nathaniel Greene, who's a very well-known general, really interesting guy, leaves his Quaker background behind. He is totally self-taught when it comes to military science, yet he has a personality that enables him to be a command presence. And Washington very quickly relies on him as just a stellar general. So he writes, people coming from home with all the tender feelings of domestic life are not sufficiently fortified with natural courage to stand the shocking scenes of war. To march over dead men, to hear without concern the groans of the wounded, I say few men can stand such scenes unless steeled by habit and fortified by military pride. So this whole image I've been presenting a little bit of the farmer drops the plow and grabs his musket and goes and saves the country. It just doesn't stand up. And Greene sees it right away. Today we know that things like basic training when you join the military, those are things that are starting to rewire your brain so you can deal with horrible things you might see in action. So he knows right away this militia system has real flaws. George Washington, this is in the summer of 1776 during the New York campaign, which does not go well for the Americans. Our situation is truly distressing. The militia instead of calling forth their utmost efforts, are dismayed, intractable, and impatient to return. He added that the militia show an entire disregard of that order and subordination necessary to the well-being of an army. So in his nice way, he's saying they're deserting in droves. Entire regiments are going home and taking all their guns and ammunition with them, which is not helpful to George Washington. They have no ability to function the way an 18th century army should. If you guys have studied this time period of the American Revolution, I guarantee you have come across the teenager's name, Joseph Plum Martin. He's quoted very often. It's one of the few memoirs that's still in print, and you can go to any bookstore and buy Joseph R. Martin's memoir. Great reading. He writes, I believe the enemy, this is about an engagement in 1776, I believe the enemy's party was small, but our people were all militia. And the demon of fear and disorder seemed to take full possession of all and everything that day. And later he writes, when I came to the spot where the militia were fired upon, the ground was literally covered with arms, knapsacks, coats, and hats. These guys dropped everything. You know, and often you have a case where they're in line, and the minute the British or the Germans start to advance, they're like, see us. I'm not interested in this at all, and they just turn tail and run. So here he knows exactly what the militia was, because their stuff is all over the place. And I threw one in here, because we'll come back to a theme that's brought up here. This was later in the war, now 1781, a handful of Virginia militia officers gave this petition to the Virginia Assembly. The militia has been considered as a natural strength of a nation, the cheapest and surest defense, but it is impossible that an army chiefly composed of troops without experience should meet an army of veterans upon equal terms. They are saying we've been through this whole war so far, these guys, they cannot face down professional European troops. But I put this quote in here because that word, the cheapest, this comes up again and again. If you do not have this militia system, what are you talking about? Immensely huge standing armies that have to be paid. And what do you do with it? You station with every coastal city, every frontier farm, every little village. How do the expense is mind-boggling. So they're kind of stuck with this militia system. Despite all this negativity, of course, we are going to gain our independence, and that is going to be largely because of French help, French guns, French troops, French officers, and the French Navy, especially. So we will get there, right? But as soon as the war is over, what's the decision? We can't have a huge standing army. If you remember from your history classes, our first government in America was the Articles of Confederation, a very ineffective government system that, among other things, the government was unable to tax people. So there was no money coming in to have any kind of a standing army. So we're getting rid of the standing army, and we are going to once again rely on our militia, even though every single founding father knew the militia was terrible. And if I wanted to make this slideshow a lot longer, I could have put in quotes from James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. They all say horrible things about the militia regularly. 1787, we have our Constitutional Convention. They want to first revise the Articles, and they say, oh my God, the Articles are terrible. Let us write a whole new government. And now with this Constitutional Convention and the writing of the Constitution, what do we end up with? We also end up with a Bill of Rights. What's probably the most talked about part of the Bill of Rights today? The Second Amendment. All right, the Second Amendment. So let's check it out. Here it is. So controversial today. It spawns lots of t-shirts, bumper stickers, lots of comments by politicians. And the Second Amendment, you hear it all the time, any day on the news. Well, here it is, though. It's one sentence with a couple commas. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Simple as that. When these guys are debating it, and I put final form, there are many drafts of it. When they are debating this, they are not talking about individuals' right to have guns and have as many guns as they want. All of their discussion is about the militia. That's what it's for. So people living a couple hundred years ago did not argue about the Second Amendment like we do today. They knew exactly what it was for them, and that was for defense of the country, for the militia system. So why are we doing this now? Why? They all know it's bad. They write it anyway. They put it in the Bill of Rights. So what's going on here? Well, we have a lot of rhetoric that I've just covered some of. Louisburg, Lexington and Concord. There is some good stories you can drum up about the performance of the militia. But also we have this fear of standing armies, and it's pretty prominent for the first several decades of our existence. Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence writes, "The king has kept standing armies amongst us in a time of peace." It's there, and we have to adjust our modern thinking to kind of deal with this, because in our time today, when we talk about the military, it's support the troops, our finest, our best, and our brightest. We are a very pro-military community, but that is a fairly recent development in terms of American history. For most of American history, it's not the government that's the distrusted evil thing. The government's the good thing, because we are the government. We vote. If we don't like someone, we vote them out of office. The potential tool of a tyrant and the potential danger is that standing army. And that has a lot of pull. Even at the same time, they all know that you need a standing army to really fight against a foreign foe. Here's our cost again, too, our cost of national defense. We have to have this. We don't have money. We are a very poor, kind of struggling young nation in the 1780s and 90s. And so this is the only way. And this is where we start talking about, too, the people keeping and bearing arms. You have to have that. Because if you decide that people don't need to keep and bear their arms, the government is going to supply the militia with all their muskets. Oh my God, how does that? Who pays for that? And where do all these guns come from? Guns are all made by hand back then. It's just not feasible. So you've got to have this militia system, and boy, you've got to have everyone supplying their own gear, or you simply can't deal with the expense. And the last one, and this is really the focus of most modern scholarship right now, and that is fear of slave insurrections. There is no greater fear for Southerners than a slave insurrection. It is a constant level of anxiety. We know about certain famous slave insurrections like a Nat Turner or maybe a Stoner Rebellion, things like that. But if you compile a list of slave insurrections that don't make it to all the history books, the textbooks in school, it's a lengthy list. Because, big shocker, Black people don't like to be enslaved. So there is constant revolt and constant resistance. And this comes up a lot in the discussions about the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment. This is where we have a lot of discussion on who gets to control the militia. What can the presidents do? Because the southern states are very concerned that if the president calls out the militia and takes them from your little Virginia town and brings them to Richmond or brings them to Philadelphia, who's minding the store back home? Will the enslaved people rise up when they know the militia is out of town? So this comes up over and over again, and this a lot of why we have the Second Amendment are the Southern leaders of the slave states who need this because they need to. And the militia doesn't have to be that good to intimidate Black people roaming around at night. So if only a handful of them have guns at work, that's good enough. If the rest of them have clubs and axes and pitchforks, and you got 50 guys roaming around doing their slave patrols, that's enough to intimidate most of your local enslaved population. So, kind of going along in time here, we're struggling as a country. I don't know if this is a battle you've heard of, and I don't even know a ton about it myself, but I know that it is either the worst disaster in U.S. military history, or it's darn close. This was about a 1,000-man army fighting Indians out in Ohio, and in this Battle of the Wabash in 1791, the officers in this American force suffered about 88% casualties. The enlisted men suffered 97% casualties. All right, they are almost entirely wiped out. I mention it because one of the results when the word gets back to Washington, D.C. is, okay, we need to do something a little more to reorganize our defense system. And this is where we get our first Militia Act in 1792. And I just highlighted a couple of things that we're going to come back to. Because they change it and they add to it a few days later. But I put this part in here from May 2nd because here is really the job of the militia. Invasion from a foreign nation. That's a given, right? So if we go to war with England again, or France or Spain, whoever, that's boom, they're there. Warfare against the indigenous peoples. Obviously, our Indian wars are just a kind of a common occurrence in this time period. And lastly, here's our stopping any insurrection against the government, and then word about the president has some authority over the militia. A few days later, we have our a little more of an explanation. Here's our final ages. The ages are a little different than they were in colonial times, 18 to 45, and that's going to be the system for the rest of the history of the militia system. And the other highlighted part there, here's what I have on the table. These are all the things that you're required to have by law. If you don't, you will be fined when you show up for your militia muster days that are a couple times a year. So there's your musket, there's your bayonet, your flints, your knapsack. You can also have you need to have a cartridge box that has 24 cartridges. You can also have a rifle and a shot powder horn. So those are your basic items that you need to have by law now that you are a member of the militia. So that brings us some of the stuff that we have here. So what I put together is just the whole system that you would have to have, that you have to supply yourself. This is a pretty neat copy of a militia cartridge box in the collection of Old Stories Village. And for me, as a history nerd guy, if I see something like this at a gun show or at an auction or something, I'm going to open it up and I'm going to look inside and I'm going to start counting. So guess how many little loops there are here? There's 24, because that's the law. So I know this was a militia cartridge box because it meets the law requirements. It doesn't have 12 or 18 or 60. It's got 24. And you need to have all your ammunition, which is wrapped with gunpowder and the ball. You need to have a belt, which I have here. You need to have a bayonet that hopefully fits your gun. So that's key. If you don't have those things, and you have a rifle, here's your rifle pouch, here is your powder horn. This would also mean I passed when I was inspected and was not fined because I've got these things and I don't have the cartridge box. I have my 2 flints. So I'm covered for that, no fines there. Now, these are pretty cool. So this is a genuine, honest to God, this is the real deal. This is a militia musket from 1827. So this time period that we're getting into in the 19th century, this was made in Massachusetts. Guns have a lock, a stock, and a barrel. The barrel and the stock are handmade in Massachusetts. The lock was an imported item from England that they buy in bulk, and they just had to pop it in there and kind of build the gun around it. So, like I said, if this could talk, all this crazy stuff we're gonna get into soon, it would have some stories to tell. This gun costs money, though. Here's the problem. By the time you get in the 19th century, I may have to shell out 3 or 4 weeks of labor to pay for my militia stuff. That's not going to go over well with a lot of working class people, because that's a big expense. Now I have a second musket here, which is similar to the first one. It's a flintlock system. This gun was made in 1831. However, it is light years different from that one in terms of technology. This gun is almost machine made with interchangeable parts. It's right on the verge of that. And that's something that the US government pushed for very hard after the War of 1812, because guys were losing bayonets and losing parts, and when you lose a part, if it's interchangeable, you just buy a new part and pop it in. If it's not, some blacksmith had to grab a hunk of metal and make you a custom-made brand new part. That's not very efficient. So this is technological, this is state-of-the-art military-grade musket. Some militia guys are going to have these, especially this one was made in Philadelphia, and a lot of the government contract guns were given to militia. So this was very, very likely used by militia groups. This may have even been kept in someone's home, which is pretty weird to think about. You know, if we were in the militia today, this would be like the government giving us an AR-15, and we would just keep it. You know, take care of that, and when you need it, you need it. So this is a, this is a military grade assault rifle or whatever you want to call it. And some guys, when they were issued these, I know some cases in Virginia, they sold them. Because you can get a lot of money for a cool militia gun or military gun. So all these things get me covered. I do have a canteen from the time period, not required by law, but if you're marching around all day and you want to be drunk all day, I would definitely put something good to consume in this. But we'll get there soon. And the last thing I didn't mention was a knapsack. And that is the original of this copy that I made of this knapsack. And again, when you're a historian, you kind of geek out about gear and stuff, and you also become a little bit of a detective. And I put this picture in here because, you see the stitching on the edge of this, which I have faithfully recreated. If you want to sew two pieces of fabric together in this time period, and you want it to last and actually work well, you do not do this. You do not sew, you never ever sew anything together like this if it's gonna be under some stress and some wear. So the detective brain in me says, this tells me this knapsack was never really intended to be used in the field. This simply checks a box. I need to have one of these by law. I'm never gonna go fight. I'm never gonna put blankets and food and stuff in here. I've got to have this on my back so I don't get in trouble. So there's a lot of these around here. These are very rare. Originals are extremely rare today because many of them are painted with eagles and all kinds of motifs, and that makes them folk art, which makes them very, very valuable on the antiques market. So I made a real simple one because that's within my artistic skills. All right, back to just a couple other additions to this Militia Act from 1792. I thought this was kind of neat. This is from the state of Illinois. They had conscientious objectors back then. It's not just a Vietnam thing. So you could be a conscientious objector and not serve in the militia. Now they're going to get you to do something, and this makes sense to me. Now, if you're not going to serve the militia, we'll put you on road work, which makes sense. If we're involved in an invasion or something, we need to move troops around, good roads are going to help you do that. There are a lot of exemptions too, and the exemptions are usually, you can imagine, your judges, your political leaders, the mayor of towns, and doesn't have to be in the militia. Other people, though, if you run a ferry, that's transportation, you don't have to be in the militia. If you run a big flour mill, well, in time of war, we've got to feed bread to the troops. That gets us. So there's different ways to get out. For the most part, it's by law, and you're there whether you like it or not. There's a little bit of tweaking in 1795 just to kind of clarify what the president can do. In 1808, Congress authorizes them to spend $200,000 a year to beef up equipment in the state militias, state arsenals. So we start getting some central government money going to the states to buy more of the good state-of-the-art guns, for example. And this all, it's making sense to people because our army, up into the Civil War, I'm generalizing a little bit, it's rarely above 10,000 people. That's not much. If we go to war with England with a 10,000 man army, we're not gonna last long. But if you call it the militia, now we're talking 1 million people, oh, that could be a force to be reckoned with. So they're gonna embrace this system, and they're gonna say things like, a country of well-trained militiamen is not conquered when its army is beaten. Every additional district the enemy penetrates possesses a means of its own defense. So you don't just beat the American army, you're gonna beat every single town in America, their militia. That seems really hard to do if you're invading. And the militia, of course, are always prepared to resist aggression, but while they're doing that, they can still run their farms and do all the domestic work and be ready to go. And here's a guy, his name is William Sumner. He's the adjutant general of Massachusetts in the 1820s, 1830s. Really, all this stuff is on Google Books. It's really easy to find and read. But he writes some pretty neat stuff. And right in there, disciplined militia changes the whole course of the invader's operations. He can form no plan for want of a fixed, determined object. The militia are not collected together in a body, but are all around him, in his front, on his flanks. So he basically says, if you're an invading army and you land in America, you are surrounded all the time. So how great is that? That's a great system. Our first big test, War of 1812, and I can do this slide very, very quickly. The militia did horribly badly in the War of 1812. Oh, it was not good. And here's the Capitol being burned, of course. And following this War of 1812, now is where we start to get the change to the stuff that I got obsessed with when I was a little kid in Sturbridge, Massachusetts. And that we now enter the golden age of militia mayhem. So in the East Coast, if you live around here in the 1830s, you're thinking, well, what's the danger? Where the Indian attack coming from? They're not. Are we going to go to war with England? It's highly unlikely. We're already well on our way to paving a very good relationship with the British that we maintain to this day. We're now at the stage where we're meeting twice a year. The colonial guys, they maybe met 6, 8, 10 more times a year. This is now twice a year. If you guys have ever played on a sports team and wanted to go to state championships and you practice twice a year, you're not going to the state championships. Not happening. They don't have a clue, these guys. So they don't really care. They show up, but they don't care in drill and training, but boy, they like to drink. So here, I'll introduce you to a really neat artist named David Claypool Johnston. And this is probably the most famous painting depicting a 1820s, 1830s militia muster. And here it is. These guys, I just went over all the stuff, they don't have hardly anything. This guy here, well, he's got some kind of cartridge pouch on him probably, and he's got a bayonet, so you won't be fine for that. But that cornstalk isn't going to shoot very well. But we know they did this. This guy is bringing his musket from his shoulder onto that guy's foot. While this guy was bringing his musket up to his shoulder and took this guy's hat off. We got a guy over here with an umbrella. We got this guy's getting poked in the butt. This guy's just totally disinterested. I mean, this is a mess. Now, you might say to me, hey, that looks kind of like a cartoon. And it is. And I will be very honest with you, this guy is a well-known satirist. So this is satire. However, as we go deeper into this, my question to you is this satire or is this reality? Also a neat book that's you can read for free on Google Books. Emily Burke. The book is published in 1850, but she's writing about her days in the 1820s and 30s, watching his militia days. So check it out. In Savannah, Georgia, they're called ragamuffins, those militia companies. And I never heard a name more appropriately applied. Scarcely any two were dressed alike or took the same step. And whenever I saw them approaching, some with a shoe on one foot and a boot on the other, Some with the guns wrong end up, others with them on their shoulders, wearing their knapsacks bottom up, wrong side out. I could not help thinking one might suppose they were learning how to catch up their guns and knapsacks and effect the most speedy escape in time of danger instead of facing the enemy. So I'm starting to think David Claypool Johnson was not doing too much satire there. I love this one from Indiana. There was one day in the year through which old and young looked forward to with pleasant anticipation. It was muster day, the day in which the local militia donned their uniforms, shouldered their muskets and sidearms, and paraded before an admiring populace. The law required all able-bodied men between the ages of 18 and 45 to muster at least once a year, and from reports which have come down through the children of these patriotic citizens, it seems that muster day was the one big day of the year. They came on horseback, on foot, in wagons. The old came, the young. They came partly to see the muster, partly to see each other, but chiefly to eat gingerbread and drink cider, beer, or something stronger. And some to engage in regular annual fistfights. This is a good way to get yourself ready to defend the country, right? The column, the infantry down here. The infantry and other uniformed companies led in the march. Then followed the great unwashed, the flatfoots, which consisted of the finest possible burlesque on military movements. Men with all kinds of hats or no hats. Hundreds of them barefooted, most in their shirt sleeves, or at best with linsey wamus is just a really crude work jacket. Some with canes, some with hoop poles, some with cornstalks, some with fence rails 10 feet long, sometimes 4 abreast, sometimes 10, some sober, some drunk, and thus they marched. Ludicrous as this must have been, it constituted a muster in the eyes of the law, fulfilling their legal obligations. And this is perhaps my favorite. Check this out. Whiskey retailed at 15 cents a quart, and some of those old cornstalk soldiers could drink several 15 cents worth in a day. By noon on this eventful day, the fistfights began, and from then on until the end of the day was over, individual combats were waged on every side. More blood was shed in this way than there was ever spilled by the militia at the performance of the Now, I'm not a good math person, but if you're drinking several 15-cent quarts, what are we talking? We're pushing a gallon of whiskey a day? I drink a gallon of whiskey a day, I wouldn't even know my own name. You know, these guys these guys could put it away. And you should know that in this time period, this is the time per capita of the greatest alcohol consumption in American history. So you might think, oh, how about the 1960s? They were wild, or the 80s were really self-indulgent. They were crazy. Nobody can touch the booze consumed in the 1820s and 30s by Americans, especially on Militia Day. So in here it says, and so it continued until the latter part of the 1830s, when the militia almost died. A few other things that are there. I love this quote from 1834, mostly because of the last line. The militia is worse than useless. That's one of my favorite. I hope I'm never called worse than useless. That's not good. In Vermont, in 1828, the more moral part of the community cannot view the scenes of vice and profanity and debauchery, which nearly all of our military exhibitions conduce to, without feeling the latent presentiment of coming evil to the country. I mean, the country is going to fall apart because this is just a train wreck, these militia days. And another gingerbread reference here, the musters with their gingerbread and cider booths, their sham fights, their drunkenness, gambling, fighting, wrestling. These fortunately are no more, says a person in 1886. This is the one most local document I have to share with you guys. This is Frederick, Maryland, so not too far away. And this I found this very interesting. Here are their muskets in the militia fit for use. Then we have muskets that need a little mending. Then we have some that need some cleaning and mending. And then we have some that need very serious repairs. 550. This is not a militia that's ready to do much. They hardly have any guns at work. Now, one of the last quotes mentioned the sham battle. So the sham battle is what we would call a battle reenactment today. And it was supposed to be the culmination of the militia muster day. So all the training and practicing and drilling that you did during the day, you would then show off your skills in this battle reenactment in the afternoon with the other militias from other local towns. So bring up Mr. Johnston's artwork again. Here we go, the sham fight where you were displaying your military prowess to all those in town. I love this guy right here. You know, when you learn how to load one of these muskets, you know, everything is supposed to be pushed down with the ramrod. So if I had my 15 cents worth of whiskey though, I might forget to put that back. And there you see I fortunately pinned the man's hat to a tree opposed to his head to the tree. And here we have just more mayhem. People are just, it's broken down into fist fights and people are falling down, their guns are going off and people have clubs. And so this is not a nation prepared to take on the professional armies of Europe, for sure. So what's going on here? Because it wasn't that long ago that Thomas Jefferson himself wrote, "None but an armed nation can dispense with a standing army to keep ours armed and disciplined is therefore at all times important." And former President John Adams in the 1820s writes, "Whenever the militia comes to an end or is despised or neglected," which it's starting to get that way, "I shall consider this union dissolved and the liberties of North America lost forever." Strong words, means people, but the system is falling apart. And here's the deal. Most people are now understanding the militia doesn't work. It's incompetent. And that can be helped a little bit if the officer crowd knows what they're doing. They don't have a clue. They know no more than they're men. So they're supposed to be up there with their sword leading the way, and they don't have an idea. One of my favorite accounts from this time period is an officer who was about to run his company into a fence or some kind of obstruction. And he's in a panic, and he can't remember to say like right wheel or by the right flank march or some military term. But you know what he knows how to do? Drive oxen. And when you drive a team of oxen, if this is your team of oxen, you stand on the left of them. And you want them to go right, you say G. And when you want them to go left, you say ha. So what does this guy start doing in his company? G, 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 over here. Oh, now ha. And this is a guy, they're supposed to be training for serious defense. He's starts the running, and he doesn't say halt to stop marching. He says, whoa! But they're all farmers, and I guess they knew what was going on. But without the threats, without any seriousness behind this whole thing, there's just no reason for anyone to take it seriously. It looks like an outdated system, which it is at this point. And as I mentioned before, it's expensive. So do you want to spend 3 or 4 weeks of your paycheck to buy stuff that you're going to use twice a year and really isn't important at all in any way? And that there's a lot of resentment that's going on there from people who really can't afford to do this. So a very interesting thing starts to happen in the 1820s, and it's called this fantastical movement. Starts in Philadelphia. And the aim of these guys, as crazy as they've been, they're like, let's up the ante. Let's get much, much crazier. We'll get so crazy that the authority will cancel all militia days. We'll ruin the system because we're so insane. And some of it's a little sad. They elect a guy who's both mentally and physically disabled, and they make him their colonel of their regiment. His name was John Pluck, and so they parade him out. They are dressing, and I did my best to have some stripes and plaids and color and kind of mismatch myself in honor of these guys. They dressed as bizarrely as possible. We know at least one man who tied a goose to his head as a hat, which I love, because so often when you see someone dressed like me, you expect me to be like, "Yes, madam, let's adjourn to the drawing room for some fine conversation." Meanwhile, it's going to say, hey, help me tie a chicken to my head. It's really cool. So it's so humanizing to these people. But they are, and at one point they put John Cluck on an elephant even in New York City after leading the regiment literally on an elephant. So these guys are going out of their way to be so insane that the system will be canceled. This is called a tin kitchen. If you've been to historic sites, you might have seen someone cooking in them. We know that some of these fantastical guys was using them as their knapsack. You tie some straps to it and you say, hey, it's kind of like a knapsack and you can't find me because I got something on my back. And I'm calling that my knapsack. So now we have some progressive social movements that are appearing for obvious reasons. So the drinking as a society is unbelievable. And that's where the temperance movement comes from. This temperance movement, by the way, still affects us today. We are the only Western nation with a 21-year-old drinking age. And every other nation that has it, it's like a Bahrain and Egypt and Indonesia, Cameroon. There's a bunch of nations that have 21, but we're the only Western nation with 21. And we have never caught up to the previous drinking levels. In 1833, the American Temperance Society writes, the ardent spirit as a drink is not needful or useful. It is a poison which injures the body and the soul. It deranges healthy action and disturbs the functions of life. It tends to bring those who use it to a premature grave. And my favorite, this is about 1840, temperance poster. This walks you through the whole thing from your very first little social drink to working your way into becoming a regular drunkard, and then you're in crime, and then you've left your wife and kid, and then at the end there's really no option but to go your head. Suicide is the only alternative for a intemperate individual. But the newspaper articles you read from the time period talking about Militia Day say this is disgusting. This is a disgusting thing. It must stop. And this gains a lot of momentum. Now, are there militias that are okay? And the answer is yes. Everything I've been talking about so far is what we call the standing company. Those are the guys that do it by law. They have to. Guys who wear stuff like this, or my incomplete, partially made jacket here, these guys do it because they want to. They think it's fun and it's cool. And maybe they even have political aspirations. You know, how many of our presidents have been generals or militia leaders? You know, we have Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson. These are people that get their start in the militia. So people who dress like that, look like these guys, they are called volunteer companies. They drill more, they get good equipment, they are a little certainly better off and could probably maybe even fight in a real war and equip themselves well. So eventually what happens is they kind of let the standing companies fade and these volunteer companies take over. The problem is that it's cool for a couple of years to be in a volunteer company, but you don't want to do it for lots and lots of years. So they start to struggle. And so by the late 1830s and through the 1840s, the militia system is for all intents and purposes, it's dead. Then what happens in the 1850s, though? Sectionalism, right? Now the Civil War is knocking on the door, and people are starting to get riled up again. What do they do when they get riled up? And we're going to go fight those Northerners, or we're going to go fight those Southerners. You join militia units again, volunteer militias. And now it's nice when we're studying this topic, we start to get photographs we can look at, not just artwork and artifacts. Famous New York militia, famous Alabama militia. These are volunteer units, that's why they're dressed in those fancy uniforms. These are the guys who will have some training. You can see these guys, they go out and target practice. They target shoot. These are the guys who will become the basis for the armies of the North and the South when the Civil War breaks out. They will be built in many cases off of these 1850s generated volunteer militia companies. And I'll throw this in because this is fairly local history and it goes back to the reason I moved down here from Massachusetts to work at Harper's Ferry. John Brown's raid in 1859, we see the militia in action again. This is them in action right on the eve of the Civil War. The guys here are not dressed in uniform. they either may not have had time to put their uniforms on, and we also know that all the local towns made ad hoc companies, kind of like the old standing companies. They grabbed people together, grabbed what guns they could dig up, and sent them off to deal with John Brown's attempt to start slave insurrection in Martha's Ferry. I just read a couple nights ago, though, reports from some of these guys. So these guys are on the eve of civil war. Things are very serious. It looks very much like we're going to go to war with ourselves. And so we need military forces. And these guys still didn't have guns that worked. So the man who moved the report for Jefferson County, West Virginia, he said there were only 100 guns in the whole county that could be relied on. And the Frederick, Maryland militia are still having their problems, who was here at the John Brown's raid. He had 135 men in his company. Less than 30 of their guns worked. So we're still dealing with the same problems that won't be really sorted out until we get these massive Civil War armies and get them trained. So bring this back to our Second Amendment here. This system, as crude as it is, it's going to remain fairly untouched into the 20th century, into around 1903 when the National Guard gets formed. The Second Amendment is not going to be interpreted any differently than what we've been talking about until the 21st century. That's the first time that they kind of re-examined the Second Amendment. And this, back to my friend William Sumner here, I love this quote. I found this a few years ago, and how wrong he turned out to be. So he is writing up here about the regular militia for the security of the free state. But check this out. Neither has the meaning of these terms been left as a matter of doubt for future construction. How wrong he was, huh? So we fight and argue and get riled up about the Second Amendment. He actually goes out of his way to say, no one in the future is going to argue about this because it's about the militia. And what does he say? A well-regulated militia, then, according to the Constitution, must be defined as an organized, officered, armed, and disciplined militia trained to act as a military body. So he's like, there's no way they're going to fight about it in the future. Not the case. And I started thinking about this. I threw in a little extra slide here. What about this infringement that we talk about? You know, it spawns so many T-shirts. You're not taking my guns away, kind of T-shirts. Well, first of all, the right to bear arms was always infringed on because it never included indigenous people. It certainly didn't include enslaved people, and nor did it include free blacks. They were not to be in the militia system. There were some very rare African American militias. They were not sanctioned by any state. They become more prominent in the 1850s. There's a couple of examples during the War of 1812, but by and large, they will become a bigger deal right in the Civil War. And why still would why do you want people to have guns in their homes? And here's a great example from our man William Sumner. It is true that it's better if the arms should be kept by the men themselves at their own dwellings than in the public arsenals. They thus learn to take care of them, and if you have opportunities for hunting, in fact for shooting, they will improve their marksmanship. So he got this whole thing worked out. The problem is people don't take care of their guns, and they rust and they become literally non-functioning. So I started digging around trying to find an example of infringing on our personal rights to hold to carry arms. I found one in Virginia from 1819. What was happening in Virginia at this time is people were keeping arms in their houses and they weren't taking care of them. So the state decides to build a public arsenal. The arsenal will hold all the guns until they are needed in an emergency, and they'll take care of them. So check it out. When the arsenal is finished and the guards for it enlisted, the executive shall cause as many of the public arms to be taken from the hands of the militia and to be deposited in said arsenal. So there's a honest-to-God example of the right to bear arms being infringed by the government. But again, it's because this is good for the militia. This is what's good for the defense of our country. Oops. What did I do? Okay, there we go. And I just want to close off this part here with what was the interpretation that was done in the 21st century. It was this Columbia versus Heller, and you can read it, you can look it up. I'm not going to go into the details here with our time constraints. But it revolves around this guy, Dick Heller, who, whether or not his Second Amendment rights were being violated, if he wasn't allowed to keep an unlicensed handgun. And they were trying to challenge this. This was all about challenging and redefining the Second Amendment. They found a bunch of people, only Heller's case sort of fit the bill, so they dropped the other people and went with him. The reason it's significant here is because the Supreme Court, in a very tight, controversial decision, says gun ownership is not solely connected to militia experience. So going contrary to everything we've looked at so far this evening, they say that's not the case. And that's a huge game changer. And I would argue that the Founding Fathers would be very, very surprised if they appeared all of a sudden and looked at this decision, because again, all of their debates that went on were all about the militia and the defense. And in the Justice Alito wrote the case. It's a 64-page report on for the decision. He refers to the English Declaration of Rights. But that document didn't really deal with individual rights. It was all about how is the power shared, which we're dealing with between states and federal government. And it was also written during a time when almost nobody owned guns. You had to have a certain amount of property and money to even own a gun back in the 17th century. And so it wasn't really a factor of gun ownership, because it was like less than 1% of people could afford to have enough money to be allowed to have a gun. And it was also a time when you had massive gun restrictions. As soon as handguns are invented, tons of gun regulations come out in the 17th century because it's dangerous to the public good to have people carrying concealed weapons for a long time. So just to kind of bring it up to our modern time a little bit, I find it really, really interesting. But this is where we are today, as opposed to all this history of the militia system. And I'm going to take just a few minutes to kind of close out on a very different, switch gears here a little bit, because I've been kind of busting on these guys all the time. But they had one thing going for them in those days when they needed practice, and that was some music. And that's been the love of my life here, has been playing the drum and playing fife and drum music. The purpose of fife and drum music, besides communication, was to give a beat to March 2. And if I can make this work, I'll give you a little bit of a sample. So this has been of great interest to me personally. I'm thinking, how does this work? You've got to give a beat to March 2. Now today, if you play in a country band or a rock band or whatever, the drummer has all kinds of stuff because he's got hands going. So he's got a bass drum, he's got a snare drum, he's got all these cymbals. So all that collectively makes a beat to March 2. Well, we don't have that here. I've got one drum. So how does this work that we're going to make a beat to march to? And fortunately, we have surviving accounts. And I put up some pages that probably all looks like Greek to you guys. These are surviving militia books from the time period. Why were these books published? Because these guys knew darn well the militia was a mess. And when you read the introductions of these old books, it'll say, we are really trying our best to help these poor guys who can't march or fight or do anything. And so let's try to get the music organized. And if the music is playing nicely, then maybe that will help these guys march around. So all of this is a fun detective operation for me, because all these things are different. So I have to, like a detective, figure out what all these bizarre symbols mean and translate them into something I can play that hopefully has a really good rhythm and a good beat to it. But it's all different. You know, this guy writes things like a story. This guy writes everything on one line. This guy writes everything on two different lines. It's just a mess. But fortunately, when you learn drumming, and drumming is somewhat unchanged for about 500 years now, all that Greek hieroglyphics up there are composed of these things called rudiments or lessons. So what a musician in this time period is doing is they are learning all these lessons and then assembling these lessons in different formations to make what we call a beating. The basis, everything, I don't know why this is, but everything revolves around a drum roll, which you guys everyone's heard a drum roll, right? But I don't just sit there and go like this forever, because that's not a beat I can march to. So these drum rolls are cut into pieces, and they usually have an odd number of strokes because you have to it ends with one hard stroke. So for example, in that piece I was just playing, it starts with a 5-stroke roll, which is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Simple as that. Up to speed. The other roll I played in there was a 15-stroke roll. That's 15 actual different strokes. A lot of tunes are built around what's called a 7-stroke roll, which is literally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's what it sounds like up to speed. Here's another lesson. It's called a flam. And a lot of these things have, they're named these funny names because it has a phonetic sound to it. So if you know this. So a flam sounds kind of thick when I say it. Well, so as opposed to a single whack, a flam, I use both my hands, and this one hits just a little bit sooner than the other one. So it's a thicker flam sound. So if I've got my 7-stroke roll and my flam, here's another cool one that's very, very centuries old, called a paradiddle. It's called a paradiddle because it sounds paradiddle, paradiddle. That nose will be a right, a left, a right, right, and a left, a right, and a left, left. So that becomes paradiddle, 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 paradiddle. So if I'm a Revolutionary War veteran teaching some kid in my town, I don't necessarily have to show them a book like this. I can just line them up and say, okay, let's go. Paradiddle, 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 paradiddle. And we can work on that. I'll show you one more. It's called a 3 and a 2. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So a 3 and a 2 is. So here's an example then. If I take my 7, my flams, my paradiddles, my 3 and a 2, I can play something like this and put them together in different ways. So that is a beating that goes to a tune called Knowlton's Quickstep. And I played that because I showed you the John Trumbull painting of Bunker Hill showing Thomas Knowlton brandishing his musket. In this time period, the 1820s and 30s, we developed a genre of music that is commemorative of brave Americans and famous events. And so one of the tunes that we play in this time period for 1830 is called Knowlton's Quickstep. That's a commemoration of Thomas Knowlton, who dies in 1776. Now the trouble with this, here's where this gets confusing now. If you look at the tune Haymaker up there, it says a 7 and 2 double flams. Now you're starting to kind of understand what that means. That's a 7-stroke roll and 2 sets of 2 flams. If I look at this, that's a flam right there. If I look, that's a flam right there. So you gotta spend a lot of time deciphering these hieroglyphics to figure out what all these things mean. I'll play you one more little clip to finish up. Here's my thing. And this, what we're playing here, is this, United States March, published in the 18 teens, one of our early patriotic national airs. Let's see if I can make this work. By the way, I'm playing in this video. I'm playing this drum. This drum was made about 1820, and my 2 friends also are playing original drums. So if you want to hear what music sounded like in this time period of militia mayhem, this is as close as you can get. Repeats itself. So I did okay. I have talked about this stuff my whole life, but I've never done this in a formal lecture-y PowerPoint, but I did okay. Got 15 minutes to spare. If people have any questions, I can try to answer them. And I also encourage you to come up if you want to touch something or pick up something that's from this time period. I'm really into stuff like that, touching things from the past, and please feel free. Other than that, thanks so much for coming out.
Are there questions for Sam? Jenny?
I have a question. If you were in the band, in the militia band, were you exempted from frontline service?
Pretty much, but the War of 1812 is kind of the last war that musicians are on the battlefield. They are fading out quickly. So they are mostly for ceremonial, for marching, for drilling, and for communicating orders in camp. The one thing that's cool, and then this is I tried to finish it for today, but I just couldn't. This is a commercially available, would have been a commercially available militia musician's coat around 1830. As a musician, I might buy something like this simply because I'm in a slightly different position as the poor schmucks who hate being out here, and so they're just going to get drunk. The musicians were paid. So they are about the only people getting paid, and they're paid because they have a skill. Because not everyone can play a drum or play one of these guys, play a fife, which I cannot play. But I have one. This is also an artifact from about 1830. So it's a little, yeah.
Did drummers accompany marches in the Civil War? You indicate they did.
They are going to be on the battlefield, but not playing music.
What about the marches?
In the marches, yeah.
Long marches.
Yes, at times it depends. If you're coming through a town, probably yes, but just like in general over long marches, like if you're marching all day long, they're not going to play very much. The men move at what's called route step, which is just kind of slog along at your own pace. And so the drummers are all going to have their drums slung over their backs. But they be there, and then, so a lot of that being played. And like I said, in battle, they're going to be stretcher bearers. They're going to help. They're going to assist the surgeons. And there are certainly a famous example of Antietam, where all the musicians their drums are taken away and they're given muskets. Try this one. Instead.
But they sang when they marched.
What's that?
They sang. There were a lot of songs.
Yeah, oh yeah.
local,
I mean,
their own
music
songs.
is huge. And diving into this period of music that I've done my whole life, it's dance music, it's political music, it's patriotic music. It's just it's everywhere, and people love it. Hearing pipe and drum music like that, you don't hear it a lot around here, but that just like this would have been part of your daily existence or your yearly existence doing militia days. You would have heard this music all the time. You would have known all these tunes I've been playing for you would know them because you would have heard them 1,000 times.
Are you still with the National Park Service?
No, I worked for them for about 3 years and went. I volunteer there still. I do mostly volunteer work at different sites.
Thank you again for the militia in early America, a civic duty with gingerbread and hard cider. We have cider, it's not hard cider, but now you all understand that title for sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what state you're reading about. They drank a lot and they ate a lot of gingerbread. I don't know what the gingerbread is obsession, but it comes up over and over and over again.
I'll see.
Please help yourself.